Hey, what's up? This is Mr. Ippolito, and today we are going to crush textbook reading for Chapter 9, Section 3 and Chapter 9, Section 4. As we've done previously, this is not an audiobook. This is not me reading the material to you. This is simply me helping you to better understand how to unlock textbook reading, not just for this class, but for any other classes, just some strategies for that. And then just some things that I think are particularly interesting for 9.3 and 9.4. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, just like before, one of the things that I like to focus on are the key terms and people, right? So I think that those are helpful to look at as you are going through the reading. We'll talk about some of them in a little bit more depth. I also like those main ideas, right? So conflicts with the Mexican government led American settlers in Texas to declare independence. So another thing that I like to do when I can is spiral information. So information that you've learned in one place, you're going to learn it in another place. So this is an example of that. We've watched The Alamo. We've kind of learned about it, talked about it, discussed it. We watched the movie. And so now this is just sort of like the background of what happened and kind of stuff that you've already learned about before. But so, I take these headings, right? So the original heading said Texas wins independence. So I changed that to how did Texas win its independence, right? So what was the story behind that? And kind of like how did that all start? So again, these subheadings, growing conflict. Well, conflict between whom? Conflict over what? So who's in conflict? And then what is the reason why they're in conflict? So you want to be looking at that as you're reading. Again, spiraling. You've seen these people before. There is Juan Seguin, the Tejanos. He was the leader during the Texas Revolution, right? And so you're reading about that. Dictatorship, that is an important vocabulary term. Learning about the dictatorship that Santa Anna, that was his form of rule, right? One person rule. This is not a democracy. This is a dictatorship where one person makes all the rules. And not only was he the president of Mexico, but he was also the lead general as well. So then learning a little bit more about this, we talked about siege warfare. What that is, it's when the enemy surrounds a fort or like a walled-in city. And that was the technique that the Mexican army was using against the Texans at the Alamo. It was a siege. You're basically just, you got them surrounded, and then you're just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for 12 days. And then finally on the 13th day, that was when the attack finally happened. Again, we saw all this in the film, The Battle of San Jacinto, the 18-minute battle where Sam Houston won, and he captures Santa Anna, and then they force him to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence. In the film, Sam Houston, played by Dennis Quaid, says, "You want blood, or you'll settle for blood, but I want Texas." Okay. Continuing, Republic of Texas, there's another great vocabulary word, annex, right? It means to kind of take territory and make it your own. So asking these questions like, what does that mean to annex, and how does that apply to our history? So you're looking at that in the context of Texas, and then looking at that in the context of Oregon. I like this, looking at this phrase, Texas remained an unsettled question. So why was the annexation of Texas controversial? You should read about that and learn like why is it? What was it that made Texas so controversial, right? What is adding up? What is contributing to this tension over Texas and this tension with Mexico? Talked about spiral learning, like bringing it back. Speaking of spiraling, we've seen this word seed before. That was actually one of the questions that I put on the Ed puzzle for when we were watching the video on the growth of a nation, right? And how we added the different parts of land over time. So you've seen that vocabulary term before. Maybe that'll be important. If we've seen it before in a video and we're seeing it again in the textbook, maybe it's important. That word seed, it absolutely is important. Opposition to war. So in almost every war in American history, there are people who are in support of the war, like, yes, let's go to war. And then there are people who are opposed. So who was opposed to the Mexican-American War? That's what we're learning about right now. And you should understand there are two separate wars that we're learning about during this time: the Texas War for Independence and the Mexican-American War. There are similarities and differences between the two. You want to make sure that you understand the differences between both. And then rebellion in California. So this is when California is rebelling and becoming its own republic, its own independent country. It'll actually become its own. There's the very first flag of the California Republic, we are going to be the fun fact here. California is going to be its own independent nation for a hot minute, for 25 days. Sonoma, California, up north. That was where the capital was at the time. The Mexican flag was raised over the capital at Sonoma. And then the Bear Flag Revolt. That's when the Bear Flag, right? This is our flag right there. That was when the Mexican flag was taken down. The Bear Flag goes up. And then 25 days later, the United States Army rolls in and they're like, all right, we'll take it from here. So they lowered the Bear Flag and then raised the American flag, right? The Stars and Stripes. So we were our own country for a whole 25 days. Then it goes over a little bit of the invasion of Mexico, how the United States Army forces invaded Mexico. I want you to pay attention here. The occupation of Mexico City. Santa Anna leaves. So Santa Anna, the president and the lead general, both. He leaves Mexico City. The United States marches into Mexico City. And important to note that whenever you're in warfare, when the capital city is captured, that usually means that the end of the war is not far behind, right? So finally, this idea of achieving manifest destiny, it was our goal. So how do you know when you've achieved your goal, right? How do we know that we had actually successfully achieved this goal of manifest destiny? So I want you to be thinking about that question. This also spirals that information that we saw in the video, which you can go back and watch that video again if you'd like. It's a great video, The Growth of a Nation. And that is the end of Chapter 9, Section 3. So moving into Chapter 9, Section 4, go a little bit faster on this. Well, this is just more detail on the Mexican-American War. And then finally, a rush to the west, right? So we already read in 9.1 and 9.2 about moving out to Oregon Territory. We learned about that part and learned about moving, traveling along the Donner Party and the California Trail. So now we're just learning a little bit more about movement out west, the Mormons. So who were the Mormons? Why did they settle in Utah? Where is Utah? And again, we're going to bring up this idea of push-pull factors. So why were the Mormons being pushed out of where they were, and why were they being pulled into that new location, right? So again, thinking of those push-pull factors, it talks about how they moved out to this the land was not hospitable, meaning it was all desert. There was no farming. There's swarms of crickets. It's not a very hospitable land, but sometimes people like to go out to desert locations to live there. So there are some pull factors here. And so we want to ask the question, why didn't the Mormons go to Oregon? Why didn't they go to California? What is the pull factor? So I'm kind of connecting it to, places that we're familiar with that are nearby. Acton, Palmdale, Agua Dulce. These are kind of places that are, some parts of Palmdale, they're way out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. So why do families sometimes move out to inhospitable or desert locations? What is the pull for those locations? Okay. Who was in conflict? So this subheading, conflict with the government. Who was in conflict with the government and why? Figure that out. Learn about that. There are the Mormons right there moving out west. And then finally, we learn about the gold rush. So what's so interesting about the California gold rush? The 49ers. Figure out what the nickname 49ers, what is that all about? How about water rights? Learn a little bit about that and about mining towns. Again, this reinforces something that we already learned in that History Channel video that I thought was really interesting. This idea that, the majority of gold miners who were mining, looking for gold, the vast majority never got rich. The people who actually made money off of the gold rush were people who were providing support services, goods and services, selling to the miners. And that included a lot of women who were, like you see here, ran boarding houses, hotels, restaurants, laundries, and stores. Links across time. I asked the question, LA is still the second largest city in the U.S. Which city is the largest? Of course, this book was written a few years ago. Back when the last census was the 2000 census. We now have most recently the 2020 census. LA is still the second largest city in the United States. Then the final section here, California's changing population. So I would ask the question, kind of change this heading. In what ways did California's population change during this time? How was it an unusual mix of people? Again, interact with those headings. You're learning about Chinese immigrants, about African Americans, Native Americans. We just learned about women in the West. I thought this was interesting here, how it talked about there were some Slavery was outlawed in California. However, there were some people who still tried to bring their enslaved people into California. And I thought this was interesting about how other miners objected to that, right? They believed that anyone who profited from mining should participate in the hard labor of finding gold. Like, you don't know, this isn't fair for you to bring people that you own. You should do the hard work yourself. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting commentary. Not that they were necessarily opposed to the practice of slavery in general, but specifically they thought that it was unfair, right? Or undemocratic. Like, if you're gonna mine for gold, you're gonna do it yourself. You're not gonna have somebody else do it for you. Impact on Native Americans, and then impact on the Californios. The Californios were the Spanish-speaking people who were already there from the days of when it was under Spanish rule, and then later under Mexican rule. Another fun fact: there were far more, I think, like by a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio, far more Spanish speakers in California at the time that we became a state than English speakers. And so California is the only state in the United States that has both their constitution in both English and Spanish. And then finally, the last part right here, looking back and looking ahead, California had enough people by 1850 to apply for admission to the Union as a free state. As you'll read in the next chapter, the issue would cause a national crisis. What? So one of the things I want you to think about as you're reading is, like, what comes next? What comes next in the story? And why would California's admission to the Union cause a national crisis? So just kind of something to think about, look forward to later. All right, I've spoken long enough, and I hope you got some good out of this, and good luck in reading, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our next class. Take care. Thanks so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.